Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're plunging headfirst into the swirling, often pretty intense conversation around artificial intelligence.
Yeah,
You hear the buzz constantly, incredible breakthroughs mixed with some serious anxieties about what's coming next.
definitely.
Our goal in this deep dive, to try and cut through some of that noise, look closely at how these AI narratives are actually put together, and figure out what it means for you personally as things keep changing so fast.
And we're primarily guided today by a really insightful piece, William L. Weaver's article, AI's Crystal Ball. It uses a specific public discussion, actually a popular podcast episode, as a kind of lens to examine these big ideas.
Right.
We'll be pulling insights mainly from that source and maybe a few others it mentions.
And what immediately jumps out, right, is the core tension Weaver highlights, these
Yeah.
starkly different visions of AI's future that are floating around.
Exactly. On one side, the promises feel almost, well, utopian, you could say.
Yeah.
Unprecedented abundance, innovation, just accelerating like crazy.
And then on the other side, the warnings sound pretty dystopian. Mass unemployment, loss of control, even, existential risks to humanity itself.
It's a powerful contrast.
Yeah.
And understanding why these two poles exist is, I think, really key to navigating the whole AI landscape right now.
Okay, so let's unpack this polarized landscape a bit more. Weaver points out you hear this everywhere now, the sort of AI will save us all narrative right alongside the AI is going to take your job and maybe even end the world thing.
Absolutely. And the article uses a specific episode of the All In podcast as a kind of case study for this.
Yeah.
The hosts there really dove deep into the more pessimistic views, what's often called AI doomerism.
Right, the doomer side.
Yeah.
And that discussion, as Weaver analyzes it, really mirrors the big themes he's tackling in his piece.
Yeah.
The difference between AI's actual impact versus maybe just the perceived impact, especially on human roles.
Mhm.
How predictions about the future can be, while strategic tools used to influence policy and public opinion,
Mhm.
and crucially, the vital importance of things like systems thinking, continuous learning, and, individual agency in how we respond to all this.
Right. It shows that podcast conversation wasn't just about like the tech specs. It was a window into these much bigger societal and frankly personal challenges we're facing.
So for you listening, this initial look is really just about getting a handle on the fundamental disagreement that's playing out right now. You've got loud, powerful voices pushing very different versions of the future.
And probably the most immediate anxiety for most people when they hear about AI is it's about jobs.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. The fear of job displacement is huge, and it's a major focus in Weaver's article and the podcast discussion he covers.
The AI doomer perspective on jobs, as it's presented through figures cited in the source, is, well, it's quite stark. Dario Amodei, the CEO of Anthropic, for instance, is quoted predicting a potential spike in unemployment,
How big a spike?
potentially hitting 10 to 20% in just the next few years.
Wow, okay. And did he name specific areas?
Yeah, he pointed to sectors he believes will be hard hit, particularly entry-level roles: tech, finance, legal, consulting. Weaver notes Amodei called for lawmakers to step in and for CEOs to be more upfront about what he called mass elimination of jobs.
Which, that directly feeds that deep-seated fear, wasn't it? That machines will just make human labor obsolete.
It does. But Weaver's article also presents a really compelling counter-argument, drawn largely from David Friedberg and David Sachs in that same podcast discussion.
Okay, what's the counter?
Friedberg highlights a fundamental economic principle that the doomer view sometimes maybe overlooks. AI can dramatically increase the return on invested capital, the ROI.
Okay, let's break down ROI quickly, just in this context.
Yep.
If a company invests capital, salary, equipment, now these AI tools into, say, an engineer, and that AI makes that one engineer way more productive, maybe 20 or even 50 times more efficient.
Right, the return on that capital investment, the ROI, just skyrockets. And the argument is when you get such an incredible return, companies don't just, sit back. They are strongly incentivized to deploy more capital.
Ah.
And that fuels more projects, faster innovation cycles, and historically speaking, that kind of expansion actually creates more work in entirely new categories of jobs.
It kind of reminds me of the historical perspective Weaver touches on, from the very first tool humans used up through the Industrial Revolution. The pattern has often been that technology leverages human ability, increases capacity and investment, leading to more overall activity, not less.
Yeah, and Sachs reinforced this, actually citing Satya Nadella from Microsoft. He suggested that to see truly massive job-ending unemployment, you need economic growth conditions. We just haven't really seen like GDP expanding 10% year after year,
Which is huge.
which is huge. And that level of growth itself generates enormous wealth and, inevitably, new jobs.
So that's a powerful economic counterpoint. Though Chamath Palihapitiya, who was also part of that discussion Weaver analyzed, offered maybe a slightly more nuanced take.
What was his angle?
He suggested the total number of jobs might not just plummet catastrophically, but the nature of work is absolutely set to change dramatically.
How so?
He used that really striking example, saying new graduates sometimes function almost as like glorified autocomplete for senior colleagues.
Right, doing the more repetitive stuff.
Exactly, the task-specific work. He argues that today's AI models can handle many of these entry-level task-oriented functions much more efficiently.
Which implies a pretty significant structural shift for young people entering the workforce now.
Definitely. So what we're seeing here, according to Weaver's analysis, are these different economic lenses being applied to the same massive technological disruption. And it ties directly back to those core independent variables themes we often talk about.
Right.
How rapid change forces adaptation, demands we maybe redefine work, and puts a real premium on the skills AI can't easily replicate.
It really highlights that you're not just hearing different predictions flying around, you're actually hearing different economic models trying to make sense of what's coming.
But, okay, beyond just the economic debate about jobs, which is huge, Weaver's article takes a really critical look at why. Why are these particularly dire predictions being made with such, volume and intensity?
And here, the consensus drawn from the sources Weaver looks at, well, it isn't always that it's purely objective forecasting. Things might be more complicated.
This is where it gets really interesting and maybe a little murky. Weaver details potential motivations and agendas behind some of the loudest alarms being sounded.
So go on.
Well, Palihapitiya, for instance, observed that some dire warnings from certain AI labs, like Anthropic, seem to align, maybe coincidentally, with their big fundraising rounds. Weaver suggests this could be seen as a kind of smart business strategy. Frame your powerful tech as potentially dangerous, but position yourself as the uniquely qualified, responsible steward needed to manage it. That could attract investment.
Okay, that's one angle. What else?
Then there's a significant focus on what Weaver's article calls the effective altruism, or EA industrial complex.
Right, I've heard that term.
It's described as this heavily funded movement, significantly backed by figures like Dustin Moskovitz through Open Philanthropy. The article alleges there's this kind of inflated ecosystem of interconnected organizations linked to EA that appear to engage in something the source calls astroturfing.
Astroturfing. So making it look like grassroots concern when it's actually orchestrated.
Exactly. Creating the appearance of widespread public worry about specific issues in this case, about AI's most extreme or existential risks, the so-called X risk. Weaver details specific policy goals attributed to this group.
What kind of goals?
They seem to be pushing quite hard for stringent global AI governance, meaning things like advocating for regulation of computational resources like the GPUs, the powerful chips needed to train advanced AI models, pushing for international agreements on AI development, and embedding very specific ethical frameworks into AI governance structures. And Weaver's article points to some significant connections here, close ties between key figures in the EA movement, leadership at companies like Anthropic.
Anthropic again?
Yeah, even mentioning a co-founder's marriage to someone who helped distribute Open Philanthropy funds, and also ties to influential former government staffers who championed AI safety rules, and then later joined companies like Anthropic.
Okay, so suggesting a potential revolving door or alignment of interests.
That seems to be the implication raised. And the Biden AI executive order, which is discussed in the sources with its emphasis on safety requirements and this diffusion rule restricting GPU sales,
Right, limiting who can get the most powerful chips.
is seen by some commentators noted in the article as aligning pretty closely with this alleged EA agenda for global compute governance.
Okay.
So the overarching argument presented in Weaver's piece is that fear, whether it's fear over hypothetical AI-created bioweapons, a claim the article notes was amplified and kind of walked back, or fear of uncontrollable superintelligence down the line, or even the immediate fear of massive job loss fear itself, is presented as a tried and true tactic.
A tactic used by whom?
Used, the argument goes, by groups aiming to increase governmental power and regulatory control over this new technology.
So does that work?
By amplifying fear, the idea is these groups can basically manufacture demand for government intervention to solve the problem,
Right.
potentially in ways that serve specific ideologies or benefit particular entities. Sachs is quoted arguing that the hardcore ideological element behind some of this fear-mongering is often, in his view, hardcore leftist, seeking maximum government empowerment. Potentially leading, he warns, to a future where the government actually uses AI for surveillance or control, which is, a pretty chilling thought.
It is. So, just to be clear for you listening, this section, based on Weaver's analysis, isn't about dismissing all concerns about AI risks. Those are definitely real and need discussion.
No, not at all.
But it's about encouraging you to look beyond just the surface predictions. It suggests applying that systems thinking we talked about, thinking about the different players, the money flows, the potential feedback loops, and yeah, maybe some hidden agendas that might be actively shaping this very loud public conversation about AI safety and risk.
It really shows how information itself can be a tool here, right? Predictions and warnings aren't always just neutral data points. They can be strategically deployed as part of a bigger game of influence.
Absolutely. And recognizing that possibility really demands your agency, your ability to critically evaluate these claims instead of just passively accepting whatever you hear.
Okay, so if we take seriously the idea that a profound technological shift is happening, which, let's be clear, even the optimists in the sources agree on, the really practical question becomes, how should individuals, how should you navigate this?
Right. And this brings us neatly to the part of the source that directly addresses personal response. It links perfectly to that idea of education as agency that we often explore. What can you actually do in the face of this level of change?
Well, a key piece of advice highlighted is to actively embrace the new tools, to become, as Palihapitiya puts it, AI native.
What does that mean in practice?
His strong counsel, especially for new graduates or people early in their careers, is to really steep themselves in the tools right from day one. Get hands-on.
Weaver's article uses a pretty good analogy here, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Comparing it to the past shift in programming.
Yeah, from more complex compiled languages like C++ to higher level, maybe more accessible languages like PHP or Python.
Right, and established developers initially resisted that, but those new languages ended up vastly expanding the whole developer pool.
Exactly. And the warning here, drawn from the source, is pretty clear. Being rigid, refusing to adapt to these new AI-powered workflows, well, that's probably a path to being left behind.
Weaver also notes that the perceived speed of change with AI feels much faster than previous tech revolutions. People feel it's happening incredibly quickly.
Which makes a mindset of continuous lifelong learning not just nice to have, but absolutely essential.
Yeah, because even if entire job roles don't vanish overnight, AI is likely to automate the more routine bits, the chores, as Weaver puts it, within most multifaceted jobs.
Right. Requiring humans to adapt and focus on the higher order tasks, the things AI can't yet touch: creativity, complex problem-solving, interpersonal skills.
Exactly. And Palihapitiya shares his own hiring observations in the source material. He finds the ideal setup now involves experienced mentors combined with, quote, an overwhelming corpus of young, very talented people who are AI native.
Interesting.
He sees established professionals who resist adapting to AI struggling, while young people who intuitively grasp and use these new tools are highly sought after by innovative emerging companies.
And Sachs makes that point about AI coding assistants being a huge leveler for junior programmers, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that by using these tools effectively, less experienced individuals can dramatically accelerate their capabilities. It gives early adopters a really significant edge.
So all these points strongly support that independent variables theme in Weaver's analysis, the kind of education that really builds agency.
It's less about just acquiring a static set of skills for today's market.
And more about developing the fundamental mental framework needed to understand and master tomorrow's tools, whatever they turn out to be.
And that framework, building on ideas from previous sources Weaver references, is grounded in understanding first principles, really getting the core components of reality, like energy, material, information, and the logic of systems.
That deep understanding, combined with systems thinking, seeing how all the different elements connect and influence each other.
That gives you the mental agility, the flexibility to grasp these complex technological shifts, spot the patterns, and proactively figure out how your own skills and capabilities need to evolve.
And lifelong learning, when you have that foundation, isn't some burden, is it? It becomes just a natural, continuous application of these core adaptive abilities.
Exactly. So Weaver's article By really dissecting these competing AI narratives, doesn't just present a complex, maybe confusing picture. It actually offers a kind of pathway for personal empowerment through it all.
It's about focusing on learning, adaptability, and developing the critical thinking tools to truly understand the forces shaping the future, rather than just reacting to headlines.
Yeah.
So what this deep dive, guided by Weaver's AI's crystal ball, really shows us is, well, it's a landscape filled with both genuine, significant concerns about AI's impact and potentially sensationalized narratives. Narratives that might be driven by strategic goals, maybe specific agendas, and clear efforts to shape regulation in particular ways.
Yeah, the dramatic warnings of widespread job loss, for example, are met with these powerful economic arguments, suggesting AI's impact on ROI could actually drive unprecedented growth
Right.
and create new kinds of opportunities, even as the fundamental nature of work itself shifts.
Yeah.
Particularly, it seems, for those just starting their careers.
And I think a really clear takeaway is that the future of AI isn't some predetermined outcome we just have to accept. Weaver argues it's going to be significantly shaped by policy choices, by ethical frameworks, and, maybe most importantly, by the agency that individuals and societies demonstrate in navigating this whole transformation, how we choose to react and adapt.
And those calls we discussed for things like global compute governance and potentially quite restrictive regulations, which Weaver's source links to that well-funded AI doomer ecosystem
Yeah.
with specific ideological ties.
Yeah.
Those demand really careful critical examination.
Yeah.
Applying that systems thinking lens we talked about is crucial there.
And as Sachs warns in the source material, perhaps the greatest dystopian risk isn't necessarily AI itself going rogue, like in the movies, but rather powerful entities, maybe including governments, using AI technology to exert control over populations. That's the alternative dystopian vision presented.
So the core message, really echoed throughout Weaver's analysis and the broader themes it touches on, is about equipping yourself. Cultivating systems thinking helps you dissect these complex narratives and spot potential underlying interests or agendas.
Understanding first principles gives you that foundational toolkit to grasp any new technology, not just AI.
And an education focused on agency, on lifelong learning, empowers you not just to react, but to act.
These are the real tools, the article strongly suggests, to help you understand new tech, adapt rapidly, innovate, and actually participate in building what the source calls an exciting future as AI matures. Instead of just feeling fearful or resigned to whatever the latest prediction says is inevitable.
It really leaves you with a sense that the future isn't just something that happens to you, it's something you have the capacity and maybe even the responsibility to actively shape.
So here's a final thought to leave you with based on all this. Given these competing narratives we've explored and the potential agendas the source lays bare, how will you personally decide which information about AI's future you actually trust? And maybe more importantly, what does that decision mean for how you choose to prepare yourself for the changes that are undoubtedly ahead?